Part 1. Historical Sketch. Introductory Note. Bearing of European history on social science. The purpose of civil society is to secure for the people the peaceful enjoyment of their rights, and to promote morality, enlightenment, and sufficient material prosperity among all classes. Now it can be shown from European history that society as a whole failed to attain these objects before the advent of Christianity, that they were best realized when the nations were under the influence and guidance of the Catholic Church, and that the masses of the people lost the civic advantages they had previously acquired when the state rejected the Church's authority. These conclusions, which go to show that Christian civilization is the only civilization suited to man's nature, and that Christian social principles are the only true ones, are thus summarized by Pope Leo XIII. Although the Catholic Church has for her immediate and natural purpose the saving of souls and the securing of our happiness in heaven, yet, in regard to things temporal, she is the source of benefits as manifold and great as if the chief end of her existence were to secure the prosperity of our earthly lives. Wherever the Church has set her foot, she has straightway changed the face of things, and has attempered the moral tone of the people with a new civilization, and with virtues unknown before. All nations which have yielded to her sway have become eminent for their culture, their sense of justice, and the glory of their high deeds. It is clear that no better mode has been devised for building up and ruling the state than that which is necessary growth of the teachings of the gospel. The same fact is emphasized by Pius X. The Church has been the first inspirer and promoter of civilization, preserving and perfecting whatever was good in pagan civilization. The civilization of the world is Christian civilization. The more frankly Christian it is, so much is it the more true, more lasting, and more productive of precious fruit. The more it withdraws from the Christian ideal, so much the feebler is it to the great detriment of society. It is not, of course, claimed that there is an exact and uniform correlation between the Catholic faith of the people and their social welfare. It has been truly said that not everything on earth went wrong before the Incarnation, nor has everything gone right since. Still truer is it that a Christian regime cannot, and in practice does not exclude all defects and abuses, nor does a non-Christian regime necessarily imply the absence of all things that are praiseworthy and desirable. Social welfare is not the aim, but only an ordinary and natural consequence of true religion, and this consequence may be prevented from becoming actual through 1,000 intervening causes. It is only when one considers the whole history of European civilization that one is persuaded that for all the most precious elements of that civilization we are indebted to the Catholic Church. Division of the subject. To deal adequately with so vast a theme is beyond our scope. It will be sufficient for our purpose to touch only on the main headings. We shall therefore first indicate briefly the principal features of social life in Europe during each of the following periods. A. The early Roman Empire, vis-a-vis the first 3 centuries A.D., when the European nations of the empire had attained their highest development in non-Christian civilization, and before the influence of Christianity was yet much felt in public life. Chapter 1. B. The beginning of the 5th century A.D., when Christian principles and Christian teachings had largely permeated the laws and institutions, as well as the social life of the Roman Empire, and previous to the political and social upheaval caused by the Teutonic invasions. Chapter 2. C. The early Middle Ages, vis-a-vis the period from the 6th to the end of the 11th century, when the Church had to undertake afresh the work of molding the new barbarian nations, to the principles and practice of Christian civilization. Chapter 3. D. The period lying between the 12th and 15th centuries, which is the golden age of Christian domination in Europe. As this period exemplifies Christian ideals and social life better than any other period of European history, we shall treat it at greater length, chapters 4 through 7. Next, after dealing with the Protestant revolt of the 16th century and the changes in social life which resulted directly from it, chapter 8, we shall treat of the modern social movements which have sprung indirectly from the same source, namely liberalism, unchristian capitalism, socialism, and Freemasonry, chapters 9 through 13. Finally, after outlining the main social problems, commonly called the social question, to which these movements have given rise, we shall conclude our survey with a brief sketch of the modern Catholic social movement. Chapters 14 and 15. Chapter 1. Pagan Society in the Early Roman Empire. The Roman Empire. In the first centuries of the Christian era, the Empire of Rome included most of the known world. It extended from the Euphrates to the Atlantic, from Britain to northern Africa, and from the Rhine and Danube to the Red Sea. Over all that vast area, the institutions, customs, and at least in the western half of the empire, even the language of Rome prevailed. The social customs and the moral views of the people, which were practically the same over the whole empire, were a fusion of Grecian civilization and ideals with those of earlier Roman Republic. Pagan social principles. From the Christian and pagan writings of the period, scholars are quite familiar with the main features of social life in the early Roman Empire. Men centered their whole happiness in selfish gratification and mostly in sensual pleasure. Their moral code, which was founded upon the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, rested upon the same worship of self. Its principles included contempt for the weak and hatred for one's enemies. Human dignity and personality as such were not recognized. It was formally admitted that the weaker members of society, such as women and slaves, were intended by nature for the utility of the strong, just as in the Christian law it is a principle that the lower animals are ordained for the benefit of man. These principles had their logical effect in determining the functions and authority of the state, and the social position of women, children, slaves, and the poor. The state, which in practice meant only the governing classes and included but a small fraction of the actual population, was regarded as an omnipotent power against which no personal or family rights were allowed to prevail. This absolute power of the state assumed concrete expression in the deification of the emperor, who by law was regarded as a god. The emperor himself was above all law, and his sole will unfettered by any consideration of right and wrong, or by any fundamental principle of the Constitution, had in itself the force of law. The working class. The working class in the Roman Empire were slaves. In fact, all the pagan civilizations of Europe before the advent of Christianity reposed on slavery. The Roman slaves, who formed more than half the entire population, were practically deprived in law of all human rights, and belonged, like chattels or cattle, to their masters. The slaves working in the fields usually had chains on their feet. Their food consisted of bread, water, and salt. At night they were kept in damp underground cells with little or no ventilation. The old or weak were commonly allowed to perish like worthless cattle. If it occurred that a Roman citizen was killed in his own home, all the slaves were, or by a provision of the law might be, executed without inquiry or trial. The poor and the weak. The weaker members of society, such as women and children, were not allowed the enjoyment of their natural rights as human persons, for human dignity as such was not recognized. Degraded woman, writes Balmes, was distinguished by the corruption of her morals and debased by the tyranny of man. Infants were abandoned, the sick and the aged were neglected. The lot of the millions of citizens that lived in abject poverty in all the cities of the empire was little better than that of slaves. Rome alone had hundreds of thousands of hungry poor, who had come to look upon gifts of money and doles of bread from the state as their birthright. Prevalence of cruelty and immorality. Cicero quotes a contemporary as stating, although apparently with exaggeration, that there were only 2,000 owners of property in the city of Rome in his time, whereas the total population is computed to have been more than 1.2 million. The great majority of the rest were slaves or proletarians. Poverty was the one unpardonable sin in the eyes of the Roman, who recognized nothing excellent in the human person apart from his goods or his power. Charity, love of the poor, even hospitality in the Christian sense, and as we understand these virtues, did not exist. Immorality of the grossest type was universal in both sexes and among all classes, and cruelty and oppression reached a degree that is now scarcely conceivable. We read of 400 slaves being put to death in one house, in pursuance of the inhuman law that when a citizen was killed in his own house, all the slaves were executed. Of 100 free citizens of the poorer classes, many of them married and fathers of families, being mutilated in order to provide a train of eunuchs for a daughter of a noble about to marry. Of 3,000 Jews given to wild beasts to devour at a celebration of a feast. Of 5, 6, or 10,000 people of all ranks in both sexes slaughtered on a mere suspicion of the emperor. Of 18,000 gladiators compelled to slaughter one another as a public spectacle for the amusement of the populace. A hideous scenes of sexual immorality enacted at the banquets of the nobles, which were further varied by the spectacle of gladiators massacring each other for the amusement of the revelers. In a word, the horrors of life in the pre-Christian Roman Empire are inconceivable even in the neo-pagan immoral world of today. Chapter 2. Christian Society in the 5th Century. Freedom of the Church. After nearly 3 centuries of persecution, the Church was at last allowed to emerge from the catacombs. By the Edict of Milan, which was promulgated in 313 A.D., over the names of the joint emperors Constantine and Licinius, and the several supplementary edicts issued by Constantine himself when he became sole master of the Roman world, Christianity, which had by that time permeated every class of Roman society, got legal recognition and even official encouragement within the empire. Nearly another century of varying vicissitudes had to elapse before it was established under Theodosius the Great, who died in 395, as the religion of the state. Society only partially Christianized. A considerable portion of the people were still pagan, and even among large sections of the Christians, many pagan customs and unchristian principles rooted in an unbroken tradition of 1,000 years continued to retain their hold. Even Roman law had not yet fully put off its pagan characteristics. Still, both laws and customs had already undergone a profound change in the early half of the 5th century, and the Theodosian Code, which was compiled about 430 A.D., shows that Christian principles had then gained a definite mastery in the Roman world. Supremacy of the divine law. To begin with, the absolute supremacy of the state and the unchecked despotism of its ruler were no longer acknowledged even in civil law. By the fundamental principles of Christian teaching, there is a higher law against which no human authority can prevail. The eternal law of God binds emperor, citizen, and slave with the same force. This principle was now definitely recognized. Hence, even slaves were now allowed rights of conscience, with which slavery in the old sense was incompatible. Rights attaching to human personality. Again, in opposition to the teaching of the Greco-Roman philosophy and the spirit of the old law, the essential dignity and inalienable rights to the human person, no matter how poor or weak, were now at least partially recognized. According to Christian teaching, all, whether slaves or Romans, women or men, infants or adults, being children of the same Father, predestined to the same eternal end, and redeemed by the same Savior, have, by their nature, indefeasible rights and inalienable responsibilities, which no human law can make void. For under the Christian law there is, as St. Paul writes, neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. In enforcing this principle, not only was the Church confronted with prejudices rooted in the pagan tradition, but the whole framework of the social organism, which was fashioned on a pagan philosophy, had to be recast. Such a reform was necessarily slow. Still, even the century after the freedom of the Church was first declared witnessed substantial progress. Thus, in the case of women, minors, slaves, prisoners, and the poor, the Church insisted from the very beginning that their essential rights be fully recognized, and she exerted her whole influence that all their other natural rights be gradually conceded. Reforms in Roman law. The right of life and death, which, by the old Roman law, the master had over his slaves and the father over his children, is withdrawn in the Theodosian Code. Children are allowed emancipation from the parents' control when they reach a certain age. Girls over 18 years of age can marry of their own free choice, and are allowed also the free disposal of their property. Slaves are allowed rights and facilities to acquire property, and many provisions are made protecting them against the injustice of tyrannical masters. Many evidences also now appear of the more humane attitude of Roman law towards the poor and weak. Thus the bishops are accorded extensive powers of arbitration in disputes, and in several other ways are enabled to protect the poor against oppression. When the parties to a dispute agreed to choose the bishop as arbitrator, the civil judge was bound by law to enforce his decision. The bishop also visited the prisons to see that the prisoners were properly treated. The provincial governors took their oath of office at the bishop's hands, and after their period of office gave an account of their administration before him. Churches, and later on, even houses in the vicinity of the church, were accorded rights of asylum, where those accused of crime might take refuge, and be thus safeguarded against precipitate punishment or personal vengeance. Hospitals, endowed from public funds, were established for the poor, and special houses of refuge were opened for orphans, widows, and poor travelers. The inhuman custom of gladiatorial combats, in which hundreds and thousands of men slaughtered one another in the arena for the amusement of the people, was forbidden by Constantine about 313 A.D. But owing to the opposition which this measure aroused, it was not enforced until 404 A.D. The abolition of gladiatorial combats was brought about by the heroic martyrdom of the monk Telemachus, who rushed into the arena to separate the combatants, and was immediately stoned to death by the populace. Owing to the profound impression created by this incident, the Emperor Honorius was enabled to suppress finally these inhuman exhibitions in Rome. The examples set by the Christians. Among the Christians themselves, slaves and the poor were regarded, in contrast with the old pagan ideals, as the equals of the rich in human dignity and personal responsibility. They were treated with special kindness by the Church. while in the Christian homes all the members of the family, including the slaves, were united by close ties of charity and piety. The principles regulating men's duties towards one another form another feature of Christian teaching, which clashed with the social ideals of pagan Rome. In the latter, self-interest and self-gratification were recognized as a fundamental consideration, while the Christian ideal is summed up in the words of Christ, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And again, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you." The practice of justice and charity, which this law includes, marked the mutual relations of the early Christians, and extended itself even to those outside the Christian fold. Such an example exerted an immense influence in the whole social life of Rome, and made itself felt in almost every detail of life. The new concept of ownership. Finally, one of the most important and revolutionary of the new principles introduced by Christianity was the Christian concept of private ownership. This was directly opposed to the non-Christian idea. According to Christian teaching, the human owner of material goods is merely a steward in the service of the supreme owner, who is God. Hence, the wealthy proprietor is bound by the law of Christ, and in those days he fully recognized his obligations to give for the relief of the needs of others what remained over after his own reasonable needs were satisfied. He was taught, too, that his own wants were to be interpreted rather strictly, excluding luxuries and even unnecessary comfort and convenience. During the early centuries of Christianity, preachers and writers were accustomed to emphasize these obligations very strongly. They insisted a good deal upon the duties and limitations of ownership and upon the fundamental right of all to their due measure of access to the material goods of the world. Although there is no proof that communism prevailed in the early church, or that the teachings of any of the early fathers were opposed to the institution of private property, the mere fact that many non-Catholic writers can assert with a certain show of plausibility that such was the case is sufficient to prove how strongly Christian moralists and preachers insisted upon the limitations and responsibilities of ownership. Among the Christians themselves, the ideals of the gospel were very largely realized, and as the Christians formed in the 5th century the vast majority of the population, their influence profoundly affected the whole tone of society. Marriage. Among the Christians, the marriage tie was then, as now, inviolable and perpetual, and the marital obligations of husband and wife mutual. Even in Roman law, although divorce and concubinage still continued to obtain recognition, both were placed under strict limitations. Divorce was made very difficult. The law discouraged it, and civil equality was established between husband and wife and all their essential marriage obligations. The social status of women. The pagan idea of the essential inferiority of women was reprobated, and completely new ideal of womanhood was upheld. The Christian matron is a type quite unknown to the pre-Christian Romans. She is the close friend and companion of her husband, to whom she is bound by ties which death alone can sever. She is the educator of the children, and the mistress of the home in which her position is secure. The important role assumed by the Christian matron in all works of charity and benevolence was also a new phenomenon. Finally, the special place set apart in the Christian law for virgins consecrated to God contributed to give to the Christian woman a dignity and a standing that were in striking contrast with pre-Christian ideas. So completely, indeed, had the influence of Christianity revolutionized the attitude of the Romans toward their women, that we find Pulcheria, sister of Theodosius II, acting as her brother's regent and guardian, and succeeding him as empress after his death in 450 A.D. The Roman slaves. The abolition of slavery was perhaps the greatest and most decisive triumph of Christianity in the social life of the people. That the disappearance of slavery among the European nations was a result of Christian principles is recognized by all historians. As the morning rays of Christianity, writes Dr. Sigerson, fell upon the nations, they first dispelled the darker clouds of slavery, and then, as the light prevailed, bondage passed away. This happened more or less rapidly in different localities, as mountains may be seen illuminated with sunshine, while the valleys at their feet are still in the shade. The slave question was the most troublesome and thorny of all the difficulties that the Church had to deal with. To liberate the slaves at once, even if it were possible, would mean a social upheaval, the result of which no one could foresee, and would have been fatal even to the interests of the slaves themselves. The numbers of slaves were immense, and the institution of slavery was deeply rooted in the manners, the ideas, and the whole social life of the people. Hence, the Church had to proceed slowly and cautiously. The Church's mode of procedure. Christianity, writes Lecky, broke down the contempt with which the master regarded his slaves and planted among the slaves themselves a principle of moral regeneration, which expanded in no other sphere with equal perfection. Its action in procuring the freedom of slaves was unceasing. The Church reprobated the false idea that manual work is degrading. She insisted on the duty and the necessity of labor for all, and on the well-grounded self-respect which the practice of labor gives. She preached the equality of all in natural dignity and personal responsibility, in the participation of heavenly graces, and in the predestination to eternal happiness, while preaching to the slaves the duty of obedience to the master's just commands, because the master's authority at the time was necessary for the common good and consequently sanctioned by the divine will. She also insisted strongly on the duties of masters towards their slaves, and had her preaching sanctioned by canonical enactments and very severe penalties. Outside of what was essential for the needs of existing society, the Church acknowledged no distinction between slave and freeman. All had the same sacraments. The marriage of slaves among themselves had the same sanction as that of the free. Clerics of servile origin were numerous, and so leveling was the Christian principle of personal equality, that the chair of Peter was sometimes filled by men born of slaves, such as Pius in the 2nd century and Callistus in the 3rd. In the Christian cemeteries, there is no distinction between the tombs of slaves and those of the free. Above all, the Church prepared the way for the eventual abolition of slavery. The liberation of slaves was endowed with special ecclesiastical favor. It was usual to perform the ceremony of manumission in the Church, and the bishop was accorded by civil law special powers to facilitate it. The Church also took liberated slaves under her special protection, and strictly forbade that they should be in any way again reduced to servitude. Under the influence of the Church, the state also made many other enactments to facilitate the manumission of slaves. The movement was further supported by the example of Christian masters, who frequently set free their whole households of slaves. Besides all this, the general attitude of the Christians toward their slaves and towards the poor set an example which profoundly affected the whole tone of Roman society. Results of the Church's influence. If the Roman state had been allowed to develop on the new lines thus marked out, the 6th century A.D. would probably have seen the complete liberation of the slaves and the establishment of a fully developed Christian social regime. The downfall of the Western Empire checked the development of Christian civilization in Western Europe, although in the Eastern Empire the movement still continued. Enough, however, was already done even in the West to permeate the fabric of Roman law with Christian principles. This law became later on the groundwork of the legal systems of the European kingdoms, which grew out of the Teutonic invasions that now swept over Europe.